Oh my goodness. We have fancy new intro music and stuff.
That intro is like, I cannot believe this started off as this like jank ghetto thing that Damien started.
Hey, jank? It was revolutionary at the time.
That's just like, I was like, what is this music? Did we pay a company to build?
The first music we had was literally me singing John Loves Community.
I still think we need to, let me work with the production team. We'll see if they can incorporate that fancy stuff. Yeah, it was on Google Hangouts and it was like, wait, is this working? I can't get this to work. Are you there?
Yeah, in 720p glory.
Yeah.
On a good day.
Man. Yeah, so it is a different time. Shuffling things around. I'm just happy we made it work. I've been like, it's like Sisyphusian, whatever. I'm trying to roll the ball uphill. I'm trying to get the community stand-ups going every week, and nobody wants to talk because they're like, we're working on preview 1 of preview whatever. So, but
they're doing real work.
Yes, but fortunately, I talked David Fowler into this. He's got this cool to-do API.
I don't do real work, is what you're saying, John.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I got to find the people who aren't working and get them on. So, rad. Okay, I am going to start with some community links real quick, and then I will turn it over to you. And so I will share the screen, and I'm sharing that screen over there. Wonderful. Okay. Doing that. These are the links. I have very few links this week. Here we go. Okay. First of all, Andrew Locke has a series. I'm not even going to attempt to dig in. He's got a up to 4-part series now on all the model binding stuff and minimal APIs. So a ton. This one is on model binding, but it's a whole like deep dive as Andrew Locke only can do. So he's I don't know if you folks have any. This is something I've seen it's there and it's on my list of stuff to like deeply read through. But
his stuff is amazing. It's fantastic. Yeah. Like, he's going deep when he ends up logging bugs and then sending PRs to fix the bugs as he's writing the blog post about how it works.
Okay,
are we screen sharing? Are we screen sharing anything? Nothing on the screen.
We're not sharing. There we are.
There we are.
I was like carefully rolling through these and pulling things out and stuff. Yeah, so it is a 4-part series so far.
It's good. Oh, 4. I haven't seen part 4 yet.
Yeah. So part 4 is it is an unclicked link for me. But there we go. It is.
I don't know if I've seen part 4. When did that go live?
Today.
Wait, that went live today. I have not seen that.
Argument expressions. What even are argument expressions?
Awesome.
Yeah. So there we go.
It's not. I will say though, it's not for the faint of heart. Like if you're just getting started in .NET, don't read these posts. Like it's kind of overwhelming concept wise. Or if you read them, just go in knowing that they're going to talk about a whole bunch of very advanced framework level things to help you understand how the simpler code that you write is working under the covers. But it's pretty deep. Like it's pretty fun.
Yeah. This is the deep stuff. So one thing that I really do like, and I know he's doing this without me even having to have seen this post before. I love the summary. I mean, when I read like a long post like this, I'm like, what even did I read? Did I catch all the stuff? And so I love that he does this. So very cool stuff. Ooh, the series behind the scenes. So there you go. Wonderful.
This is super good.
Okay. Tweet just went out. Release of RC1 of YARP 2.0.0. So the thing I picked up in here was the major change was support for WebSockets.
HTTP2, WebSockets.
Yeah. So I guess
huge improvement. It's a massive improvement over HTTP 1.1 because typically you have one connection from your proxy to the backend per WebSocket connection. So you end up having one front connection, one client to backend, and then that same connection is proxied from backend, from proxy to backend. With HTTP2, you can use the same connection on the backend and send individual WebSocket streams, which are individual HTTP2 requests, on that one connection to like end backend. So it's going to be, I think, a big deal.
Does YARP multiplex client connections in the single backend connection?
Yes.
Wow, that's bonkers.
Yeah, it has to, right? Because like
WebSockets HTTP2.
Yeah.
Like when I consider like doing it there.
Yep.
That's amazing.
So that should be a huge benefit, and we're hoping like things like the Azure Signaler service eventually could take advantage of that. So huge.
What now? Why is it HTTP 2 instead of 3? I thought we were
It
going right.
will be 3 eventually, but HTTP 3 does not, as far as I know, have a spec yet for WebSocket support.
Oh,
I assume it'll be the same as HTTP 2 because it always ends up being similar. But like HTTP 2 WebSockets over HTTP 2, the spec has been, I don't know, around for like years, like I don't know, 7 years. But it just got into Chrome last year, so we just did it in Kestrel last year. So now it's like now we put it in Kestrel, now in Europe, now it goes like everywhere. So
do we know, like when we added WebSocket HTTP2 support in .NET 7?
Yeah,
were we one of the first major frameworks to actually add that? We were, right?
Absolutely,
like,
yeah. I don't even think it supported it in Nginx,
like support
or HA proxy or any of those proxies also
like Node. Like
no.
Go with Gin and like none of that stuff supports this.
As far as I know, no. Yeah. I looked when the issue was there.
Please do.
Yeah.
I think like a lot of people, I've been paying or using YARP more lately with the migration tooling. Like the YARP based migration tooling is just so cool. I'm such a fan. So I don't know. Yeah, I've been really cool. Demoing that and stuff. I'm telling everybody like you got to get your stuff updated, and this is the way to do it. And so. Very cool. All right. Okay, this one is interesting. I love the idea. I have not done the full-on security audit, so I have the disclaimer there that I always do with identity. But he's going through and he's updating from .NET 4.7 application to .NET 7, and a big thing that I don't feel like we document clearly all the time is how to update between identity versions and going like this is jumping several forward. And wow. So here he's got migrations and basically looking at like updating the schema, rehashing the passwords, and all that stuff. I know. So it scares me, but I think this is so yeah, okay. You can help me out.
Yeah, we definitely didn't document that.
I was gonna say.
I remember when we had our very initial discussions about ASP.NET Core Identity, like back in the DNX days, like literally that far back, discussing what combination should we support. Like, should we support old ASP.NET Identity authenticating against new ASP.NET Core Identity, or vice versa, and what versions? Because Identity had multiple versions in the old world and in the new world. And I think we landed on only the forward sort of migration stuff was supported. And so we had a package that you could put in your system web projects that would let them authenticate against ASP.NET Core Identity, but not vice versa. And then now with the migration toolkit product thing with YARP and whatnot, that's kind of just turned up to 11, right? Like you can share tokens and whatnot between the two. So
that's right. So yeah, so that is super cool, right? That you can share the tokens between. So that's kind of a clear, smoother migration path. So this thing here, password hash and validation. Again, this like scares me. I would think just invalidate everyone and make them reset password or whatever. So I'm not sure. This is the part that scares me more.
Well, hang on, like
that's why no one has your site, John. Because you make users do work.
My naive understanding, though, there's no way to migrate the passwords from the old identity to the new identity, right? That's not a thing.
I'm not sure.
No, how do you get plain text?
You can't get the password and rehash it, right? Like
you just hash the hash password.
I don't know what. I would say go through and just like reset everyone's reset on the hashes, and then. But the rest of it, I admire the effort here of like going through and migrating the database.
You can rehash though, right? When they enter their password into the new site.
That's what he's saying. Yeah, that's
what. Like, basically, reset the hash.
You reset the hash,
First signing. But you'd still. But hang on. When you say rehash, you'd have to perform the old hash first.
The old hash to
you'd have to authenticate using the old password.
Yeah.
Then restore the new credentials with the new system. Like, just thinking
through
that makes my head hurt.
That is the hard part because you basically need to use the
old system. You need the old algorithm,
machine key or whatever,
and the old salts and everything, like the whole thing. Yep.
Yeah, we don't have anything for that as far as I know. Like, so they had to roll their own.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. This did look like it was using the primitives. So
don't let Barry see it. This scroll faster so Barry can't watch this video.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, so this is cool. We just got this video. Steve Sanderson just put it out. I have not watched it, but I think I know what it's about because we're planning on a Blazor stand-up this next month that goes deep into this stuff. So I'm quite excited about this. Let's pop this wider. So this is Blazor United prototype, and he's talking about. I don't know if you folks want to talk about this. I actually
just tell people just go watch it. Like we shouldn't even talk about it. Just go watch it.
People in the comments are already saying this is better. This is amazing. Why
it's incredible.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, Blazor just keeps. It's like how many rabbits can you pull out of the hat? It just keeps on so many things. I don't know. It's wonderful stuff. Okay. Getting close to the end here. This was really cool. James, by the way, I tried to get him on the stand-up before I gave up and got David instead. But James, I mean,
okay, so you're saying I am the last.
Well, that's always, like when you're looking, it's always the last place you find it. I stopped asking.
This is right. It's gold. You dig for gold, and at the very bottom,
there you go.
Gold, right? After you tap all the.
That's it. The
gold, mud up top.
So he said some BS about his router is dropping packets, so it can't.
That sounds fake.
It does sound fake. I said I'd load him a few packets. But here's all this cool stuff about route tooling. So eventually, when he gets his router fixed,
this has been a labor of love by James. Like we thought this was going to land in .NET 7. He did a lot of the groundwork over the last year. And then now we unfortunately weren't able to land it in 7, but we're going to land it in the first preview of 8, it looks like. And it builds on top of this compiler feature, which I think is being used for the regex. Today it gets used for the regex colorization.
Embedded languages.
And completion. Yeah, it's embedded languages that are tunneled through strings. In C#. There's now first-class support in the compiler for plugging in basically those language services at the same time, right? And so he wrote it. He's done all the work to do this for routing and made it light up in all the places that you pass a route string in ASP.NET Core. I'm super looking forward to using this. And then he's done the analyzers and the statement complete. Like, it's just amazing. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's got that in the, yeah. So there's more there. I love this, that like it's a whole stack, right? So here he shows minimal, MVC, web APIs, Razor Pages, Blazor, like it's all across them. So that is a beautiful thing. And the last link I've got is the TodoApi, and I'll just pass it over to you, David. So
I'm going to screen share my main screen because I was going to screen share this other screen, but that's probably like, my next is going to be like this. So let me change my head to be facing forward. Is it?
Such a pro.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
Here we go.
So I guess some background on this API. This API was meant to be a sample. So when I did the keynote for .NET Conf last year, I wrote a sample, or I helped contribute to a sample that used a bunch of new features in that was released in 7.0. And I was like, is there any sample that we have besides this like mega keynote sample that shows all the features that we just kind of built and patterns for how we think you should build applications? And I didn't want to have the kind of like, I don't want to say over-engineered, the super structured, architected design. It was more about showing off the features in the simplest way possible. At least that's how it started off. And then it kind of rolled into like me trying to do authentication. So this project isn't just about showing samples. It's about me learning how to do JOT tokens and issuing and, revocation, which I didn't do yet, but how to use Auth0, going through all the posts on Reddit and Twitter and all the places where people complain about how our stack sucks, and trying to feel the pain firsthand, right? So let me try to build a to-do API with authentication, right? Using our primitives and our documentation. And while I'm doing it, take notes along the way, like what was hard, what was easy, what is unclear, to kind of feel the pain that customers do when they're trying to do this stuff. So it started off simple, and now it's this super complex beast, sort of. But I think I basically added more as I learned more, right? Refine things, try to keep it understandable overall. So the entire point is you should be able to walk up to it and understand what each of the apps is doing, what the purpose is, and then ask questions if things are strange. So like go on to discussions and ask me like, what is this insane thing you're doing? And I'll try to explain it. At first, it was just an API backend, so that's why I had to do API as the name of the thing. But I ended up having a front end because like having a front end, you kind of needed the end-to-end to show how to do authentication with cookies in the front end and then maybe Jot on the back end. So I started off with just a back end to do API, and then it bled into having a front end database that led me to like the backend for front end pattern. And it led me to all kinds of questions. So I figured we could just talk about where we are currently, how it works, how it started off, and how it grew from that point. And then figure out if people have questions along the way, I can answer those questions.
Cool.
All right. So there's some instructions.
Can you zoom in just a little bit?
Zoom in, yeah.
Cool.
So here's the overall design. There's two applications. There's a Blazor WASM front end. That is the client part, the UI, and that's a separate project. And then there's a back end for that front end, the what we call BFF in this domain. That's an ASP.NET Core app that essentially all it does is it does the authentication dance. So it will authenticate to like Google or Facebook or wherever is configured in the application, which I don't even have on this machine because I've been coding this on my laptop. Anyway, we'll figure that out. And then the backend is the actual to-do API, that has the Swagger and an open API spec. That is authenticated as well, but by a JWT, not a JOT token, but a JOT, because the T is token, right? So.
No, I know you mentioned it, but can you explain a little bit more detail the backend for front end pattern?
Yeah. So there's this. I don't want to say it's a meme. There's this issue when you want to have an API and you want to have it to be authenticated, right? But you don't want to store the tokens in an untrusted client. So if I only had this layer, the backend, and I didn't have the BFF, the Blazor front-end application, which runs in the browser, is going to request a token from the API, and then it has to store the token somewhere securely, right? And then it has to use that token in every request to say, I'm authenticated, right? Give me so that token represents the current user. So it's sent with every API call has that token embedded. That's one pattern. And you can basically secure the token by storing it in non-local storage, storing it in a closure somewhere in memory, and hoping you don't have a cross-site scripting issue so that people can't get to the code in your browser. And you will see arguments from different security experts on how secure this is. And maybe for your risk profile, it's fine to store it in the browser. It's not a big deal. And then you'll see also discussions about, okay, when the token expires, how do you get a new one? Let's say I get a token from the back end. I get an access token and I get a refresh token. Do I store both in the browser? So you see people saying, oh, no, you're supposed to store the refresh token in a cookie. And then that's used on, to refresh the token at some point, and it is an HTTP only cookie. And then refreshing happens like on a backend somewhere else. And it's funny, while doing this, I went on Twitter and I asked a bunch of questions like, how do you do this in this scenario? Like, how do you do these things? And there were all of these discussions about what was right, what was wrong. And I found it insanely complicated. Like, honestly, going through that process, when people say, auth is complex in .NET, it's really hard. There's two parts to it. There's auth is hard in general, the domain. Do you even understand the auth domain? Do you understand the options? Do you understand the trade-offs? And then there's like, given I understand auth the domain, how does auth the domain manifest in .NET, right? And you have to put those two together to then even begin asking the right questions. Like, okay, if I do this, what's the trade-off? So the backend for front-end paradigm basically says, I will never store a token in the browser. Tokens only exist on the server side, and the thing round trip between the browser and the backend for the front end is a cookie that's encrypted and signed. So it's and HTTP only. So the browser can never get access to the tokens. right? No one could ever grab this token via an issue in the browser because it never is in memory, right, in the browser. So the other benefit of this approach is even though the downside of this approach is if you wanted certain deployment topologies, this would be prohibitive. If I only wanted to host my Blazor WASM front end as a static asset in like blob storage or that kind of hosting environment, I don't have a backend. I don't have a server anywhere. I just want to host my front end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this precludes that deployment model. But if you are okay having a server component for your front end, then this is the most secure.
Yeah. Okay.
It's worth calling out other benefits too. Obviously, that once you have a back end, you can use it for other stuff that isn't auth or security related. Like you could do caching,
other stuff,
the APIs. You could put your own business logic in here. You could do other things, right? Like once you've got a back end that you own, and it doesn't have to be a browser app. Like imagine you had a WinForms app and it's talking to some third-party API. That all works, but you could also have a back end for your WinForms app that was yours and use the same architectural pattern, but there's no cookies in that case, right? So BFF is usually talked about in the context of a browser topology. But broadly speaking, having a back end that is uniquely the only thing that your front end, whether it's a native client app or a browser app, whatever, is talking to, and then that talks to all the other dependencies and coordinates cross-cutting concerns like auth, is advantageous in a number of different ways. But like everything we do, it's about trade-offs, and it's never as easy as saying you should just do this. The harsh reality is that you kind of need to understand a little bit to make an informed decision. And so like even in the chat here, you'll see questions like, can't I just do this? Can't I use this to do it this way? And the answer is almost invariably, yes, you can. And there's probably another 80,000 people like you who can do the same thing, but we have millions of customers, and they have, which then boils down into dozens and dozens and dozens of cohorts for various deployment scenarios, environments they run in, topologies, modalities that they expose their APIs and user interfaces in. Like, so there's no one answer, and that's why if you go to something like the Azure, the Microsoft Identity web page docs in Azure or the Auth0 docs, and you look at like, well, what do we support? They talk about like auth flows,
all the models,
like 8 or 12 of them, and you have to learn all this stuff because it's not 2001 anymore, or even like 1996, and we were just using IE with NT4 domains, and it was all just transparent. You'd sign into the Windows machine with Control-Alt-Delete. Once you'd signed in, it would transparently sign you into the ASP.NET site or the ASP site using NTLM auth. Like, those days are gone. Like, it just doesn't work that way anymore. Everything is more complicated. So there's a little bit of ground sort of base level knowledge that's kind of required to make informed decisions about these things. And it's a moving target. It's not, you learn it
changes
once,
all the time, and
then you're set for the next 20 years. Sorry. Like some of these things are thought to be best practice this year, and then something happens. Like, right now, the whole same site cookie stuff that keeps getting, they're going to do it. No, they've backed it out. No, they're going to do it. No, they've backed it out. Is keeping everyone guessing as to what's the future look like for browser-based auth moving forward. And the true answer is we don't know, which is why we have to keep our fingers on the pulse.
Same site is extremely complicated to understand. I actually spent a bunch of time playing with it, trying to understand why it doesn't just fix CSRF. And like, why do we need anti-forgery if you can do same site? And there's like a ton of nuance in what it means to make cookies same site lax versus same site strict. Versus and then I was like, man, this is buggy. I'm like, things were just not working and sticking. And I was like, why is this only happening when you come back to my domain from a different domain?
Why am I signed out all of a sudden?
Like when you originate from the same domain. And I was like, who is gonna understand any of this stuff? Like, this is really hard.
People think cores is hard. It's like, which it is.
I love cores because cores is the thing that people file bugs on at least once every 2 weeks. And it's always like, I don't think I've seen a single cores, but maybe there's been one in the last 5 years. But it's always like, I don't understand how this works, like, because it's so complex. So yeah, this is what I ended up with after, you know, talking on Twitter, trying to figure out if I should do the token thing in the browser and just ignore the security concerns, and you know, and the trickiest part is people want to be told the answer, and the answer is like, it depends on your risk tolerance. I prefer this model because of several things. The moment you get rid of the backend for front end, everything has to happen in the client. So you need a JavaScript library to do all the things. All right, and we'll get into OpenID Connect like after that, but that basically is like the next tier of like advanced token-based authentication. All right, so tech showcase, Blazor WASM, min APIs, entity framework, SQLite. I should probably use Postgres in real life.
Yeah.
That's probably the next plan, because SQLite, I don't know if it works well like when I deploy it at scale on the interwebs. The BFF uses YARP for forwarding requests from the BFF to the backend itself. I'll show that. And then testing. All right, so it kind of just shows the end-to-end of here's a sample application that does all these things that we just shipped in 7.0. So let me try to, I think this is the first time I'm running it on this machine, so we'll get to go through the actual flow and see if my instructions are crap or not. So it says first I have to install this tool, .NET tool install ef-g. Does this even work? Let me zoom in. Global tool, so I should just have to install it. Oh, it's already installed. Is it the right version though?
Hey.
I don't trust it.
Do you have to update it?
I don't trust it. I don't trust it. Let's see. See, it's like thinking. Oh, there you go. I was at 7. That's at 702. All right, then it says navigate to the to-do API folder and make dir.db. And then .NET. Look at that. What? The AI is like, let's update. Run this command and it should.
I like that you've got your installation instructions too. You've got instructions here. You're doing it locally, but you also have like Docker and you've got Thai.
Yep, Docker Thai. There are a bunch of different ways to run. I want to also show open telemetry. I had got that working in the keynote, and I was like, there is not a single place you look to go find how to build like a site with like all these features.
Yeah.
So one of the things was, can I just build a sample that has all these things built in so that you can kind of understand it? So let me see if it runs first before I start showing stuff. I also want to show how I personally organize some of these things. Extension methods. So there's two APIs. There's an API to create users from a user and a password. There's one to get a token for a user. There's one. This is one that I'll talk about later, but it's about associating an external user. So one that came from a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter or wherever is an external provider. There's no password there, but you're associating a user in my local database with some key in the foreign DB in the first place. So in those cases, you don't have a password because the password is owned by the provider, right? So Twitter or whatever. And then this is a core API. It takes in, it's just get, post, put, delete, update. It's a very simple to do API. So the goal was make the API very simple so that the domain is very simple, but it's complex enough to show you all the intricacies you have to handle when you add auth. What's funny is the moment you add authentication or users to an API, the complexity kind of explodes. And I kind of knew that intrinsically, but then trying to do it, I was like, oh my gosh, everyone is right. Everything is too hard. Everything is insane. You see, I have the authorized thing here, so I can put a token into the Swagger UI, and it'll send authenticated requests to these endpoints if I have a token. All right, so let's do the bare minimum right now.
So that tooling you're showing there with the like Swagger API and all that, that's something I believe that was in .NET 7, but like you have to wire it up to make the authenticated.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the code, I guess, to start. Normal top level statements in .NET 7. this project uses Serilog for logging. This was actually sent as a PR, and it's funny. Serilog is used for the backend logging, and I think it's a very popular library, right, in .NET. And it's not to say that Serilog is like the best thing. You should always use it, but I think this is just showing how you could wire it up in a API. So the Serilog, there is authentication, authorization, which are separate things, database, identity, and this configuration of identity is different to what you typically see in documentation. This is using identity purely as a way to store users. It's not doing the UI. It's not using any of those features. This is using the core pieces to store a user, right? And do password hashing and that fundamental part of it.
That's a good point. Like, it might be worth taking a couple of minutes to just reiterate what is ASP.NET Core Identity, like as a product, and why it sometimes, or more than sometimes,
confuses
folks. I mean, the naming is unfortunate because we have literally Azure Identity, Microsoft Identity, ASP.NET Core Identity, Duende Identity Server. I've already done 4, right? And they all come up in the context of ASP.NET applications. But on ASP.NET Core Identity is almost a framework within a framework.
Right.
It is extremely widely featured. Like, it does a lot of things under the guise of identity. And we don't necessarily do a great job of explaining that, well, you can just use these 2 features from the 14 features that ASP.NET Core Identity offers. And we don't do a great job of providing you guidance or tools for how to get into the situation that Fowler's talking about. It's like, I just want to use the features and identity that know how to do cookie auth and username and password, storage and like secure storage and all the rest of it that you want to do there. And obviously the database, I want there to be a database, a users table with like it has the passwords in it and do that properly. But I don't want the forms. I don't want a login form. I don't want a password reset form. I don't want 2-factor auth, TodoApi QR code generation. Like, that's not my scenario. We don't have a way to get your app into that state in a couple of clicks today. Like, you can go from no identity to all of identity,
all the features
in 20 seconds. And then you can override like parts of the UI fairly easily with the scaffolding tools, and you only bring into your app the stuff that you want to change. But if you just want to, like, I've got a user table, but I just want to do the cookie auth like securely, but with my user table, how do I do that? It's totally doable with identity or without identity. That's kind of the problem. It's like, well, there's probably a line like at some point where you're probably worthwhile just using identity to do that.
Yep.
But it's hard to say where that line is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's funny. So like, you know how I found these APIs? I wrote a to-do app like years ago, and I couldn't find the APIs because there's so many of them. There's add identity, core add identity, and there's all these things that take a ton of generics like role and user. And I was like, I just want to store users, and I just want to use the EF integration. And it's pretty simple in hindsight. You call add identity core with the user type that you want to be your profile, the user that you're storing information on, and then the context. So if we start from the database model, which every good site does, right? Database first. It derived from the identity DB context. This is a little bit unfortunate that you have to derive from our base class to get support. We're going to look at making this better in the future. But my to-dos are here, and I just make the to-dos have a couple of things that are pretty basic. ID, title is complete.
I just want to quickly acknowledge like a criticism here as well while you're talking about making things better. Not everyone uses EF. And so like we also acknowledge one of the challenges with identity is not only is it a framework within a framework, it's an abstraction that utilizes an abstraction that we then have implementations on top of. And so yes, identity as a system is database agnostic and data storage agnostic, but the only what we would call steel thread implementation that we have that actually works,
end-to-end that like works really well.
The end-to-end is EF core on a relational database. That's the only one that we actually ship and have good examples of. So yes, you can hook up the full identity system to a document database, but good luck. Like it's a lot
built
of work.
in, right?
It's not built in. So yeah, anytime you have like two extensible systems that then and one relies on the other, like you end up with this Cartesian explosion of like extensibility that can be really difficult to get for people to get their head around.
Right. So there are a bunch of third-party stores. So the store implementation is the kind of the lowest layer of what identity uses to persist users and roles and that information. And that's extensible. And when I call this API, add entity framework, add entity framework stores, that adds the store implementations for EF for this stuff. There's probably one for MongoDB and raw SQL without EF, but since identity relies on a storage abstraction, it needs that to function in the first place. And I happen to be using EF for my DB in general, so this model is the golden path for using our tech, right? So the to-do itself has basics ID, title is completed, and owner. So owner is which user owns this to-do, right? So pretty simple schema. And the user comes from this thing to-do user, and it is an identity user. And typically this is a pattern you use to kind of extend the user coming from our stuff, right? Which is our base user type that we understand these primitives for password, all these things that are kind of on the base type. You extend this and then add your own information if you want to store more stuff. But for my case, I didn't have any of that stuff. So it was pretty
another quick disambiguation, another overloaded term in our framework, user.
User.
So this is not the user that lives on the request. This is not HTTP context.user. That is just a claims principle. That's actually just a token, effectively. Yeah. It's just the thing that was authenticated. This user is an identity user. It's one that represents a record
database
somewhere.
User.
There's a database or a data storage, and like in the old ASP.NET, for those who have been with us for a while, we used to have two separate systems. One was called membership, and then one was called profiles. And they did integrate. And this is a conflation of both in one. And in ASP.NET Core, we have two systems. We have authentication and we have identity, and they're separate. And the request user, HTTP context.user, is whatever the authentication system has set, and it's of type claims principle, right? This user is not that. It is linked to that, usually, sometimes, mostly, but it is not the same thing. Yeah. So it's just another thing you have to kind of keep in mind.
Right. So I have my user in the database, and I have my to-do entity. And now I want to show the API. So the API is a pretty simple, minimal API. So let's go to the bottom. This is showing Prometheus, which is a database for metrics. So if that was running, I could show how we can export metrics from our core system to that system. So the sample is trying to show how you would deploy a real application with all these features that we turned on, even though it's not super real. It has comments to explain what they are, how it's configured, what it means. And then there's map to-dos, which is an extension hanging off of this builder, which will use map groups and with tags showing the new features where you can the reason the Swagger UI has the to-do section is because I added this with tag to-dos. Right. So it's showing how these features like to-dos here maps to to-dos over here. Same for users. So this sample is trying to show how you can organize APIs into a method with groups and how clean it could look in that sense.
Now this code was written before the scaffolding stuff was there, but now if you scaffold an object, it'll include those tags and stuff, right?
Cool. That's correct. Yep. Good point. Adding auth. So typically you would add, an attribute to your controller that would cover the entire thing. Now we have route groups. I can do the moral equivalent of adding an attribute to the controller by just calling a method directly on the group, because the group is going to have all the APIs inside of it. So I can say map group, to-dos, and then add a bunch of things to that group, like filter. This is a filter. this is information to rate limit the endpoint. And I can add an auth policy, require that this API has a current user, right? Pretty simple API, very clean, I think it's clean, very nice. And I'm even like using Damien's favorite feature, the results feature.
I'm still surprised by that because you're
T1,
not the
T2,
greatest fan
T3.
of it.
I kept it.
Yeah.
And I'm also using EF's new support for like running what's it called? Execute update and execute deletes. I think this is like batch updates.
Batch updates, yeah.
And deletes. So the code is trying to use all the new features of the entire stack in one demo, right? Okay, so the auth part is really interesting. So right now I have this thing that says require authorization. So think of it like the authorized attribute. And I'm saying required that there's a current user coming in, right? So normally what this could look like in like super olden days is I would write a filter, an authorization filter that would read the incoming context and it would look at the user and it would do some stuff there. Do I have a user? Is it authenticated? If it is, like return a 401 or something, right? This is trying to show how you would do the moral equivalent using the authorization system that we built in ASP.NET Core, which is tied to authorization requirements and handlers. So if you want to write code arbitrary code that runs, whenever you want to authorize a user, you can write an authorization handler. And the handler is tied to a requirement. So this endpoint says there's a check current user requirement on this endpoint, right? And whenever the pipeline runs, it will read the endpoint to get all the requirements, and it figures out which handlers have an association with which requirements. So the call to require current user basically adds the auth requirement to the endpoint. And then sometime later, the system goes, I'm going to evaluate all the requirements on this endpoint, and it will look for handlers to do so. So this handler says, if current user is not null, succeed. Otherwise, it'll fill the requirement. All this does is it says, make sure there's a current user before this API gets called, or return a 403, not a 401. So where are we? We got users. We should probably talk about authentication. So I have this extension called add authentication. And I won't go over this crazy part. That's insane right now. But the first easy part is this is using a JOT, not token. I know it's really hard to not say JOT token. It's using a JOT support in our stack. So I'm calling, add JOT bearer defaults authentication scheme, add JOT bearer. The configuration actually comes from config. I'm not configuring all the keys here by hand. We added support for default. All of our authentication handlers by default now will read this schema from configuration. Authentication is top level, and then the schemes, and then the scheme name with options. I think I have an example of this somewhere in here. Right here, look. So authentication schemes, bearer, audiences, issuers, sending keys, etc. So this got added in .NET 7 for some of our work we did to simplify authentication. Let me try to make this run now with the user, because that's the next hardest part.
While you're doing that, there's a few questions.
Tried to do it and they got it, and they got some error about security
because they didn't read the instructions.
Exactly. So that is written in the thing about the configuring the JOT token stuff, right? So it's a few steps.
We added support. So when you author an API that requires users, the first thing you have to do is figure out how to issue a token for said user, right? How do I get a user in system? Do I have a database? Do I have to configure all that stuff to even test my API? So we did work in .NET 7 to add a tool called .NET User JOTs, which is Damien's baby. And what it does is it lets you basically create JOT tokens that are compatible with your API. And you can create them with all kinds of facets. Like I can add claims to them. I can add different things to them. And it's used to basically act as a way to issue tokens for a user without having to have all the scaffolding to have a a database with users, etc. So in this project, I should just be able to run .NET user just create, and I get a token back that you're going to copy and try to hack my machine. But this is okay because it's local, and you can't hack me. So try your best. I'm kidding. Don't try your best. Don't do it. It gives me a token. I can .NET user jots list, see tokens. I have 2 of them. Doesn't matter. And I should now be able to run the application. Anyway, so it won't.
Wish I had an animation for hacked. I just have like that. You hacked your machine. Yeah.
You just need Phil's face.
Yeah. Right.
So this won't work because I actually made sure that when you add a to-do item, the foreign key has to be a user in the database. So I have to create a user. Let me create a user.
Does it fail with a validation error or just like
it'll
400?
Fail with a foreign key like awesome. So authorize this token, and then get me some post. 403. I don't have a current. Oh, good. Okay, we can look at this. So I don't have a current user. So my authorization handler failed.
Okay.
And it's because of this super awesome.
Perfect. Now I get it. Yeah, that penny dropped now. That's good.
You got it?
Yep.
So
your request comes in to hit the API, but you don't have a current user.
That's right. You got it. Yep.
Right. So we can. This is actually a really good demonstration of how authentication, authorization, and identity are different.
Are separate.
But this is a case where they've all worked together. Like he's literally done authentication, authorization, and authorization is linked to identity in this case, effectively.
Right.
He's
exactly.
user-based. And it failed authorization because he had an authentication, it was successful, but it didn't actually map to a user that he knows about. So it failed authorization.
So I have a valid token. So the token being issued is one that came configured for this application. I put it in, and I'm making a request with that specific token. So it comes in, the request is made, authentication succeeds because I have a token that's valid, right? But then my code runs and it says, find a user in the database with this name, David. And it goes, that's not a user. There's no one called David in the database. Like, you don't have a current user. This is all fake, right? User's null. So I have a claims principle. I have like the representation of a user that came in from the request. The token, right, gave me a user with a name, but there's no entry in my local DB for that request user. So now it returns a 403 instead of a 401, right? A 401 would have been, you don't have a token. So like, you don't even have a token. You can't come to me. 403 is, you have a token, but your token is not valid, right? It's not a good token.
So question, you're showing like manually configuring all this stuff. Normally the flow is going to be somebody registers with your site and you've got some code that associates all this stuff, right?
Let's do it. So John.
Yes. Give me some stuff to do.
Pass. Gosh, this is like the hardest part. Identity is like super aggressive. Like
1, 2, 3.
Let me copy this so I know what it is. Execute. And no, uppercase. What do you hit me?
Oh my gosh. It's always uppercase P. There we go.
All right. Now I have a user.
Yes.
There it is. Success. And now, since my API is super inefficient, I have to put it in again to get a token in a different API. So password, give me a token. There's a token.
Okay. So normally, like if you were actually running this service in the cloud, right? Like I would go through, I would authenticate with Google or whatever, and then it would redirect over to your site and you would register all this stuff for me.
You jumped ahead, John, but yes, it would. So normally, if I was showing the UI would be the one talking to the backend.
Okay.
The UI would launch the UI and say, log in with like a password or Google or some other provider. And then it would come back to my site. My site then has to go, I did the auth dance. Now I have to associate that user from a different place with my local DB. So there's always that step to associate the user that was like that came from the external provider with my system. So the third call on here is when you don't have a password, but you have an ID from an external party. So it would be like users token Google, right? And you associate that specific provider with an ID.
Got it.
And then you get a token back for that user as well.
Cool.
All right, so this we now have a user. We now have John's token, and now I can change the user to be John, and this should work. No, I should have a current user. So the current principal is, where is it? Identity claims like soup. Oh, this is not useful. I'm here. John, there it is, John.
Yes.
User's not null. And now this thing should return empty. You don't have any to-dos, right?
I'm out.
I didn't talk about what this thing was. This is a iClaims transformation. So the authentication system, whenever... So I guess we should talk about what authentication is in ASP.NET Core. Authentication is a process of going from the raw protocol, so like the HTTP message, to a user. And depending on what authentication you have configured, it could be cookies, it could be API keys, it could be certificates. Something has to take that raw data from the request and turn it into a user. So when you're doing cookie authentication, it's read the cookie field that we configured, decrypt it, and turn it into a user. When it's a JOT, read the JOT from the right authorization header and decrypt it, and if it's encrypted, and turn it into a user. Read the claims, turn it into a claims principal. The contract between the contract for ASP.NET Core is given the HTTP request, give me a claims principal. That is the authentication flow. The claims transformation gives the user a chance to grab the claims principal after it has been authenticated, so you can transform it. So what transform is, that's what it's called, transformation. So I'm taking advantage of that stage in the pipeline to set my current user for the incoming claims principal, if that makes sense. So I'm abusing that hook to not have to. I'm not changing the claims principal. I just happen to be setting my other user from that same phase in the pipeline. So if you want to see like more details, if you look at the call stack, whenever this happens, if I zoom in properly, like a person that can present zooms in, you can see I'm in the authenticate async like middleware. I'm in the authentication middleware when this runs. So this phase in the pipeline runs during authentication, and I get a chance to kind of say, okay, let me add more claims, let me do more things for the request to run, right? Before the request hits my code.
Okay.
All right, so let me show the actual front end because that probably makes a lot of sense to do. So painful, but I hope everyone knows how to launch multiple projects. I'll show it in slow motion. Right-click solution, properties, multiple startup projects. I want to run to do web server and to do API and apply. And I always hit Control F5, never F5. I never debug.
That's pretty common amongst us on the team. It seems that it is very much not what is common amongst our customers, but we all hit Control F5 unless we explicitly want to debug because we're impatient and Control F5 is faster.
So here's my fancy Blazor UI. Here's one password just trying to like tell me to save John's password.
Yeah.
I'm gonna type in John.
It's gonna say you've already used this password on every site.
So here's my fancy UI that took me about a week to do because everyone told me to use Tailwind, and then I went to try to use Tailwind, and it told me I had to integrate with some crazy npm script, and I was like, I am not gonna use npm. I was so anti using npm for some reason.
You could just
I didn't want to use npm.
Use the bootstraps.
I did. So I used Bootstrap, and then I asked ChatGPT to give me a UI, and I was done.
Perfect.
This is a to-do. It works. It's beautiful. It's using Blazor. I'm so proud of my UI. Like even delete works. Oh my gosh, that's not the right icon for hover. Anyway, it's fine. Check. Like this all works, right? It's doing stuff. This front end
Chat GPT UI.
They should be.
Yeah.
It took a couple of iterations to make it. I'm kidding. It did help though.
The lack of any border or padding between the top of your logout button and the view
what are you talking
window
about
of the browser Chrome is kind of irking me though.
Do you know how hard it? Do you know how long it took me to get this here?
I'll send you a PR.
It was painful. So this Blazor front end basically did what we did by hand just now to the backend API. Whenever I did login, whenever I type in a username, type in a password, click login, that whole flow happened where it spoke through the BFF to the backend API, right? And then it let me it gave me it got a token back on the backend. That token never made it, by the way, to the browser. The browser, all it has, no edge. What?
Oh yeah, you got to show us all the tokens.
What is this? Oh, welcome. Wait,
welcome
no.
to DevTools.
That's the wrong thing.
No, you got to close one of them out. Yeah, it's
this one.
That's the welcome.
This one.
They keep rearranging the DevTools window.
Something
I swear,
changed.
Every week I open it and it's like it's changed. It's like, no, I just want it at the bottom and I just wanted to open the network tab every time.
Okay, there you go. This is okay. This is new. They've moved this. This is like it used to be on top. Okay, this is different. I don't know where the application tab is.
It's not there by default. You got to hit the plus.
Yeah.
What?
They moved it. There it is.
Okay, I was just trying to show cookies.
And
so look at the little banner there. It says the focus mode UI reduces clutter. You can hit the opt out button.
There you go. Back into pane. Give me the pane. Okay. So there is never a cookie on the client side. The client side only has the cookie that is issued by the BFF. So we should look at that a little bit. No. So there's two apps here. There's the To-Do web client, which is the Blazor front end, and the To-Do web server, which is the backend for the front end. Not confusing at all, I know. The backend for the front end is using Razor Pages to host the initial page that renders the Blazor WebAssembly application. Did everyone follow that? Probably not, but let's look at it. So I have one page, a single page, and this is if you've used this stuff before, it should be like I guess obvious. But there's a single HTML page that is server rendered, which is the main page, and it renders the To-Do app component, which is a Blazor WebAssembly component using the component tag helper in ASP.NET Core. Right, so there's one page in here. There's not many pages in here. All the actual Razor files are in the To-Do web client project. One other thing that I specifically do when I'm coding these projects is I love to delete all the files until things break and then add things back so I understand why the files are there in the first place. So my Blazor app does not have any features. I basically wanted to make sure that it was doing the bare minimum. So program does not have any things being I think by default there's like these things you can mount things into. I got rid of all that stuff. It wasn't required for my scenario. I have the To-Do client in the browser that makes requests to the To-Do BFF, and there's nothing else here. I don't have a router either. All I have is the main To-Do app as the component, and a bunch of other child components like login. Actually, Steve sent me a PR to clean up my code because it was gross for Blazor, I guess. So I have a login form component, a to-do list component, and the main app component. And the main app component will render those components based on the current, if you are in or not. And then the host component renders the to-do component. So the BFF references the WebAssembly application, and it renders that application by name, and it passes in a couple of arguments here for the current user. And this is for logging into other providers like Twitter, Facebook. I don't have it configured in here, so you can't see it, but normally this UI would show me providers that are both external and the chance to create a user. So if you configure your client ID and client secrets for those providers, it'll show up here like magic. And I'll show you how that works in a second. So where are we? We are at the server application for the BFF, and it has authentication, authorization. I don't think this is required. I should delete this. Razor pages. This is YARP. I'm currently using YARP's HTTP forwarder to proxy requests from the WASM client through the BFF to the TodoAPI. Remember, there's 3 apps that are in flight here running. One happens to be in the browser, so you don't see it. And it's pretty simple. There's an auth API that's also in the BFF. So the BFF has this endpoint. The BFF calls into the backend to create a user. So if I went to this endpoint, this UI to create a user. Wait, what? Oh, I did something super ghetto. Because I'm lazy and I don't want a different screen, you just put in the username and password and you either log in or you create a user. So
that's fine.
It's fine, right?
I've seen sites do that.
It's just as jank. Let me use the same password because why not?
What would be super jank is if you would just have one button, log in or create, and if the username doesn't exist, it just creates the user.
It finds you a GUID.
I could call it go and it would just do that.
Yeah, like start.
So that works. So let's follow one of these flows. Let me make an account for myself, and I'll put a breakpoint in register user, and I'll put a breakpoint in the TodoAPI, so we can follow the flow all from the front end to the back end service. I think I brought the WebAssembly debugging, but we'll see if it works if we're lucky. TodoAPI, where's my beautiful refactoring? There you go. User API has a create. I think it's the root create async. All right, so let's debug this. I'll hit F5 now, and I want to show you how to attach. No. What do you want? It's fine. It's fine. Let's see what happens. All right. So the Blazor app is gonna call create user. This is the BFF. So I get the user information from the request. Here's a password in plain text. Oh my gosh, we're gonna get hacked. And there's a to-do client for the BFF to talk to the TodoAPI, the real backend. All right, so there's 2 hops here. So now we're in the backend, the actual backend, the TodoAPI, and I have the user information here again in plain text. Oh my gosh, and I'm using the identity APIs to create this user with a hash path. It does all the right things with hashing and salting, and everything is like great. And if it succeeds, return OK. Now I could return the token, but I don't. So I'll put a breakpoint in the token API to see what happens as well. So create happens, and the token endpoint got called, right? So what happens is the BFF, I'm like 6 programs, CS is deep.
Mm-hmm.
Where is that API? Where is that API? It's in the to-do web server auth API. So first create user async happens, and then sign in happens. Sign in, what it does sign in get the actual, where's the token call? I'm like lost in my own code. Create user async. There it is. Create user calls get token async as well. Get token async calls, the token endpoint for the user information. So it passes in the username and password to first create the user. Then it passes that same information to get a token. So checks the password, make sure that you actually have the right password for the user. And then it uses this thing called token service to create a token. Now, what this service does is what everyone on the internet who's ever tried to create a jot in .NET has copied. I copied the same code. I am no better than you. I go on Stack Overflow and I cheat as well. So that code is the same. It uses a shared secret that's in configuration as a shared key to generate the jot token, the signed jot token. The signed jot, oh my God, I said dot token. The signed jot with the right claims, and it does all the calls into the identity model APIs to create a JWT. And it writes the token, and we get it back. And like magic, what are you doing, BFF? Did I create the user already? Is that why it's like barfing? Log in. See,
if you had taken my advice and made it one button,
it works.
You wouldn't have had that
It works. It works. Look at that. So we got it working. That was the end-to-end flow. You might be wondering what the purpose is of these hops. Like it does feel like ceremony, right? Like the moment you decide you're gonna have a BFF, the calls have to be proxy to the backend somehow. So how are you gonna proxy these calls to the backend? Are you gonna like do it by hand? Are you gonna re-implement the backend APIs on the front end? It's painful, right? So for auth, since it wasn't a one-to-one translation, since create also does like get token, it's a little bit manual. But if you look at the to-do API in the BFF, what it does, it has one call. It says map all requests under to-dos and just forward to the backend. So I've configured the BFF to point to the backend of the to-do, to point to the to-do API. And I'm using that configuration both in the to-do client for the calls to create the user, and I'm using it in the to-do API to just forward all the calls using YARP. So if you haven't seen the YARP APIs, we can walk through what this code does. So we're mapping the to-dos prefix, and then this endpoint requires authorization, right? We're requiring an authenticated user to even get to the to-do API in the BFF. We'll talk about this afterwards, but I create the HTTP client once. This is a singleton that is here for the entire lifetime of the project. And every request, we're going to import the forwarder. This forwarder comes from YARP, the YARP project. And I'm basically going to say forward the incoming request to this URL with this client and this transform. So every request for to-do / anything goes to the backend. To-do URL is passed in to this API, is passed in from program CS, which is configured like right here. So read the API, read the address from configuration, pass it into map to-dos. Then map to-dos does this YARP magic. Now we need to translate the incoming cookie from the front end to the BFF into an auth token. So I didn't show it yet, and I'll show it, but the auth token is actually stored in the cookie in some crazy format. So what this code does is it says for every YARP request, you get the incoming request and the outgoing request. And you get a chance to modify the outgoing request before it gets proxied to the backend. So what this code does is it says, give me the incoming authentication information, grab the access token from the cookies that's stored, and then stash it in the auth header. And ignore this part for now. This is craziness. But this part basically says, translate the incoming cookie into the outgoing auth token. Right, and that happens transparently to like all the calls to the user. This is
your reverse proxy for the to-do API in code. So even though this class is called to-do API, just to be really clear, this isn't the to-do API. This is the reverse proxy.
Exactly.
That's living in the BFF that the front end will hit, and then this is all your translation code that manages the forwarding, the mutation of the request, all that type of stuff, and then obviously and sends the result back as well.
Yep.
And
using
there's some
good discussion going on here. So, and Damien, you've been answering these, but just to share with everybody, this is great because you can configure out your YARP can point APIs to different paths. And then as Michael was asking, like, they could be on different servers. They could go to different Azure functions.
Correct. That's right.
So it's also a form of indirection. So I know lots of .NET developers will be familiar with wrapping types. So if they take an external dependency, they might choose to wrap it with their own interface or their own type so that the code that calls that dependency doesn't change if they have to change the dependency or there's a version and the APIs change or something. This is very similar. Like you can end up doing very similar things. The front end is talking to a URL space that is governed by the backend for front end. Like the backend and the front end are the same logical app. You own both. It's just that one's running in the browser, one's running on your server, and you get to control the URL space, the protocols that are used, all that stuff in there. The backend part of that, the BFF, is effectively wrapping N other backend services, right?
Yeah.
And they could be services that you own, like in this case, or other. They could be third-party services, but your front end doesn't know that. It doesn't have to talk to otherservice.com. It just talks to myapp.com/something, and then you've configured YARP and your BFF to do all that sort of multiplexing and stuff for you. So it's a very common architecture pattern. If you zoom out 30,000 feet, that's all that's really happening here. It's just that this is how you might implement it in ASP.NET Core using YARP and all the other
using YARP and RStack. Yeah.
Yep.
So the one part I didn't show how the access token gets stored into the cookie. So as part of the auth flow, what you want to happen is you either create a user or you log in, and you get a token back from the backend API, but then you want to write a cookie so that the client app can use that to round trip the state. So what's happening here is if I look at the auth API, create token async, create user async, or get token async returns the auth token from the backend. And then there's a call here to sign in. So given a user and a token, basically sign in this case means create a cookie that represents the user information. So so this is, if you've never seen this code before, this is what happens under the covers if you're using the identity UI pages, or if you're using the APIs, the sign-in manager, those high-level APIs, they end up calling these low-level APIs eventually to do the actual auth dances and the handshake and the interaction between what the auth handler can do and what the code is trying to do. So we stashed the ID claim, we stashed the name claim, and then there are a bunch of other things here that I'll ignore for now. But the key here is we're storing in the authentication properties, which is a facet of how you can store auth state in ASP.NET Core. I'm storing the access token, which is a well-known token that we actually store as a constant. Or no, this is my constant. I'm storing the access token as an authentication token in the authentication properties, which you can store in a cookie and then get it back every request using our APIs.
So there's some discussion in YouTube and Twitch chats about like the complexity and so is it like, correct me if I'm wrong. The idea here is this is a tool, this is a pattern that you can apply.
Yes.
And as your application gets more complex and potentially you're working across multiple APIs and things, that this pattern simplifies your front end because it can just basically, the front end just talks to one thing and that thing fans out the API request, handles all the tokens, handles all the...
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it basically pushes the concerns of having to manage tokens and different authentication patterns and schemes to the backend instead to the backend for the front end instead of it happening in the browser. Like there are options where you can do a lot of this stuff directly in the browser, and then you're left with the like, how do you manage tokens? How do you manage the token if it expires, etc. That can all happen in the browser as well. Like, but depending on your tolerance for security and depending on what the app is doing, it may or may not matter, right? If you want to complicate your life or not by having this stuff.
So because you control the server more and because you can kind of centralize your logic, you can say, I know everything about the user. I've got this here. Whereas you put all that logic in the front and it's got to talk to and manage multiple different things.
Well, there's also there's a progression arc here, a maturity arc that I think can be told. And so because a lot of folks have asked in the chat, can I just put the backend and the API in the same app? And if you keep going with that logic, it's like, well, why can't it just be an ASP.NET Core app that serves a SPA, Blazor WASM or React or whatever, and has my APIs in it as well, and it's just cookie auth? Like, why do I need any of this? And the answer is you can do that, and that could literally be where you start. And one of the things we're considering is maybe that should be what our file new SPA template does, for example. And then there are these, but then it's like, well, but as soon as you need to talk to another API, or you need to add a client that isn't a SPA app, or you want to support login from an external provider, or you want to authenticate another API that you own that isn't third party. Like, once you add these complexities, then there's a fairly natural grow up path. And it's like, what we're trying to figure out as a product team is how far along that maturity evolution, I guess you could be a project evolution, in terms of scenarios and requirements, how far up that do we have to support out of the box? Like, should there be a solution in Microsoft.ASP.NET Core blah? And at what point do we go, you know what? It's getting fairly complex now. That's a reduced subset of the scenarios that our customers are facing. Absolutely, lots of customers facing it, but it's certainly not the majority or not something that really we feel fits in the box. And that's where we would recommend, like when you get to this point, you should probably go and look at these solutions, whether it's this third-party dependency or choose from one of these third-party dependencies, or one of these authentication providers / identity provided services where you go and host stuff externally and then you call into it, or so on and so forth, right? And so in my mind, I think that's kind of what we're evolving into, is that we want to kind of be able to have a better narrative, a better story arc in terms of like that progression from the simplest possible app, which is like in this scenario, it's a Blazor WASM app that calls my own APIs and I store the users. Like that's as simple as it possibly is. You could just put all that in one app. It can be one project in Visual Studio.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with that, right? At all. But as soon as, like in Fowler's example, he's supporting third-party auth. He factored out the API from the BFF, which means the API could support other clients that use different authentication protocols. Like once you have those types of capabilities, it gets very convoluted to try and do that in one project, and can actually be problematic. It's a lot easier to trip yourself up and create security problems and stuff because you've just got all this code living together, and it can be a little hard to keep track of what's doing what. So, and flexibility, the ability to deploy one thing without taking down the other thing, all those type of things become advantages once the system grows out a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. I started off not wanting to have users. I was like, how would you implement social login without storing users to protect my API? And it occurred to me, I actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out if I can use the tokens from external providers to basically how would you implement, you can log in via Google and I'm not going to store your information at all, but I need a token to somehow represent what you can and can't do in my to-do API. Like, how would you implement that? And I spent like a week trying to figure out how you would do this. And you don't do that. That's not what you do. You want to issue your own token with your own claims that represent your application. Because Google's tokens are for Google services. So you can get their token and get user information to store into your database, so you don't have to store their passwords, but you can't use their tokens to authenticate your API. That's not what they're made for.
You can.
You really shouldn't. You really shouldn't, right? That's not what it was made for.
No.
But that tangent led me down this path of like, man, if I want to do an API with stateless authentication, with a JOT, do I have to issue it? Do I have to own the thing issuing tokens, even if it's not in the same app? It seems like to get the claims that I would want to influence different concerns in my to-do API, I would need to control the issuing of the token. And it led me down this rabbit hole of like, should I host an IDP? Like, should I host my own server? If I were to use a third-party server, does it let me configure which claims get assigned to the user for my application? And that whole rabbit hole like happened enough. Okay, I'm gonna start by issuing my own tokens in a very like jank way, and then like go from there, right? And then I was looking up why is it that there's this thing I should bring up because it's actually fun to talk about. So here's an app, right? The app has a username and password, and am I supposed to put a username and password into this app? Is that secure? Like, can you trust this application to have the credentials? And it sounds bizarre, right? But when you read the OpenID Connect like documentation and you read about authentication that is like not supposed to be like when you're trying to log in via a third-party auth provider, there's no way you want to put your credentials for Google into my janky to-do app. That makes sense to me, right? There's no way I trust this app to not steal my credentials and leak it all over the world and now like I get hacked, right? Like you don't want that. So thinking about those scenarios, it makes absolute sense why you would want a protocol that is like battle hardened and industry standards, and you want to basically use a server that is battle tested so you don't have to think too hard about that, right? Now, when I think about my dinky spa app that has its own system for tracking people in the system, and the username and password only exists for the purpose of this application, I personally have a really hard time understanding why you would need an OIDC server to handle credentials when the credentials are purposed for this single application that lives only in a browser and in the backend. Like if you are literally not trying to delegate credentials to a different service or support those scenarios, why isn't it okay for you to take a username and password directly in the browser and pass it to the backend, right? That is and if you were to read the documentation about all the different flows for OAuth 2 and the ones that are insecure and banned, the reason this space is so convoluted is because they're security experts who spent years understanding all the flaws and all the issues with all these kinds of authentication. And then you have to apply it to your domain. Like you have to take the raw information and then apply it to your scenario. And nobody wants to think really hard about risks and like, am I going to get hacked? So you follow the guidance, and the guidance says host an OIDC server separately, like, and have that be the thing issuing tokens, and use these flows because these flows are the most secure. Credentials cannot leak from the IDP to the application because the application like never gets them, right? You have a browser pop up and you put in creds there and you log in and there's a dance and the app never sees credentials. And when I think about that, I think, okay, that sounds secure, but the credentials are literally for this app and there's nothing else. And there's a backend and a front end. So it's really hard to give guidance and advice like that satisfies everyone and isn't complicated. So like if you want the most secure model that works in all scenarios, you do the crazy complex thing. If you want to tell people, hey, if you're doing a front end and a back end, just do cookies, like and your life will be so much simpler and you'll be very happy. And then the moment you add a mobile app, like your life is dead. Like you destroyed your life, and now you have to learn about OIDC and auth flows, what's secure, and you're gonna be down the rabbit hole of articles trying to figure out like which one to use. How do I apply it in my situation? So I actually went through a bunch of that, like here, trying to reason from first principles, and then asking people on Twitter, like, why is this insecure? Like, why would I have to pop a browser up in my browser app? Like, why would I have to redirect to a different server to come back to my server to type in credentials? Like, it's literally like the credentials are literally for my application. So I don't understand the indirection and what it buys me in this scenario. Like maybe it makes sense like for Google, like I don't want John's like janky to do app to have my credentials. Like, of course not. Like, okay. Like whenever I'm in a mobile app and it asks me for a password, and I'm kind of like, nah.
Right.
It's kind of related to the whole thing we went through with online payments as well, in a similar way. Like it's like where I think most folks agree now it's not a good idea to store the credit cards yourself in your own database. You're far better off utilizing a third-party service that is compliant with all the various federal laws and stuff in countries about secure storage of those things, and just utilize those services to do payment, and you don't have a credit card in your database whatsoever. So like if the worst happens and for whatever reason there's a security problem in your app, or there's a vulnerability, or there's a leak, like there's no credit card numbers in your database. It's not your problem, right? And so you can kind of see in a way why a lot of industry experts and a lot of the chatter or recommendations over the past years have changed to don't issue tokens, don't store passwords, don't manage users. And you can understand why that's been, and we have to acknowledge that is the guidance that you see in a lot of places, and that why that has been stressful or confusing to a lot of folks, especially when, we know for a fact there are just lots and lots and lots of people and customers who, for very valid reasons, will never use an external database of a provider for authentication. They just won't. They have very valid reasons why they cannot do that. Yeah. Exactly.
So, and there was this question that came up, and there have been a few of these on like, hey, can't we just use like Azure AD or whatever for this?
You absolutely can.
Absolutely. But you know what came up? What I found really interesting. So when I signed up for Auth0, first time using it, I learned about Auth0, signed up for it, made the app work with it. I got the end-to-end working with Auth0. I don't have it configured here. But it was super nice. And then it was like, okay, do I need a local user still? Do I still need a foreign key to the user entry that represents the Auth0 user on Auth0? And I asked on Twitter, I said, like, do you always create a local entry in your DB for the user, even though it comes from somewhere else? And everyone said, yeah, if you want control over profile information. Because nobody wants to configure the profile information in those services, because they're different per service, and it's not standard, and it might change if you move the user somewhere else. Like, how do you control the actual information? So it led me down this path of, okay, so you use the external service to store the users, and it, like, that service now has a set of users in the DB, and your local users are all, like, you have a mirror of the users locally and remotely. And I was like, okay, are you just doing it for the authentication dance? Like, if you have users in two places, like, how do you sync them? How do you manage them? How do you make sure that they stay in sync? Like, and then I realized that Auth0 had like a functions thing, and I was like, when would you ever need to write functions in the Auth0 code? And it's because people want to customize what happens during the auth flow. Like, so the reason people may want to not use a paid service is because customizing it is really hard, and they want to write C# and they want to put it in source control, and they want to version it with their source code, and it's really, really hard to do it when you're like, you have this thing that manages your state, and you have to learn it. It's a whole domain. You have to learn Auth0. You have to learn it, like, different providers, right? So I think
it depends on your background too. Like, I think
it depends on what you want to do.
Folks coming from, we know there's a large portion, especially in the last few years, of the wider development ecosystem that is much more front end focused. Whereas you and I and John, we have a long history that primarily started on servers, right? And so we think about a lot of things in server oriented way. And then browsers, clients only became capable well after we started like that type of thing. And so we've grown up with both. And it's funny, the front end part of the ecosystem is now actually discovering the back end in a lot of ways. And we're seeing new frameworks emerge talking about the advantages of the server, and we're all looking at each other going like, like we've always had that advantage. But then you remember, no, there are literally millions of developers who have grown up with only front end app frameworks, where front end includes like native, like Flutter and Xamarin and those type of things as well, right? And so the server is a different thing. And so they have never written server code. They've used services. They pay a provider and they have a back-end service that does database or login or user management, and they focus on their front-end app. And now this custom servers, as you're talking about here, is a new concern. But for us, it's kind of like, well, it's always we've only ever had custom servers. The idea of using a service in a box and integrating that with my custom service is somewhat novel to a lot of our folks, or completely untenable. Just like, no, I could never look at all the problems that you just enumerated that could possibly happen if I did that. Our industry is about trade-offs, and it's always about learning just enough to help you make an informed set of trade-offs, a decision which is ultimately just an informed set of trade-offs for the given problem that you have that day. And guess what? 12 months from then, you may look at the exact same problem in the exact same system and decide that those trade-offs need to change and that you may reverse your decision. And we do that within the framework, within our product. And I know our customers do that within their products and the stuff that they work on as well. And that's just somewhat a reality of our industry. That's just change is something that kind of just happens. And we need to, as framework authors and product authors, part of our challenge, part of our job is trying to help everyone navigate that and give them options as best we possibly can.
Yeah. Hey, one thing that we went over pretty quickly before, but the whole type result, like, can you bring up the API and show that a little more? Because I feel like that's something we have, like a lot of people don't know about, and is really cool.
This is like one of Damien's brain children. So before, in the olden days of minimal APIs, as in like version 6, there were two things, right? Two, I guess, overall issues. There was no way to, in a strongly typed way, describe the results. And that does two things. One is you want to be able to describe the results for OpenAPI. OpenAPI wants to understand what you can return, either this or that or this in these conditions. And the other benefit is you want to get compile time errors if you return the wrong types. So when I say I'm returning a to-do item, like if I do this, give me a compile error if I mess up and pass the wrong thing. So like, no, this, oh my gosh, awful. It's just squiggle one thing, but it's squiggle the entire thing, right? look at the error of the Lambda conversion. The issue is this is returning a to-do item, not a to-do. So these strongly typed result types solve those two issues in kind of one pattern. So the olden thing you would have to do is you'd have to do produces, and you would pass in the response type. So I could say, okay, right, 200. I could say produces not found.
No, it's not even that. Like,
no, produces 404.
No, it's produces the entity type in the T, not the OK type. It would be produces to do.
Yeah.
Right.
And that would default to 200. And so like it's a weird kind of repetition, but and it doesn't exactly align with what you're returning either.
And you would basically do like a result here.
Just delete it. You would rely on inference, right?
And then this would need to be results.
Yeah.
So the problem is you want a strongly typed success return, and then you also have to, but an API call could say not found or a bunch of other things, right?
Yeah, every different result that can come back from HTTP in OpenAPI, to simplify, it basically has two aspects. One is what status code is it, and that has to be unique. You can't when you look at the actual OpenAPI document structure, it's indexed by status code. So you have this endpoint returns a 200 or a 404 or a 403 or whatever it might be, and then within the scope of one of those, you can describe a shape. You can say I return a 200, and the schema of the response is this shape, to do item, and it's formatted as JSON or XML or whatever it might be, right? And so you want to encapsulate all of that information. There was a status code and the schema, but sometimes you also want to encapsulate the media the encoding. Like, is it JSON or is it not? Minimal, everything defaults to JSON, so that's kind of implied, but you might need to do other types as well. Like problem details is an interesting one where it is JSON, but it's actually an extension. So the media type that you set is different, and so that's another aspect of what you have to set. And so you can do it with metadata like this. but you end up with this problem where you can get mismatches between what your code's actually doing and what you've documented.
Right. So I could do this in the olden days. I could say this is not going to infer an I result because these results dot return I result, not the actual concrete like derived type. And I could say to do here, and this would be incorrect. And this is the issue, and it's not caught at compile time. So this kind of solves both problems.
And ideally, we have a language feature so that you can make this a little cleaner and a little less verbose. And we are working with the language team, and hopefully, we'll continue to evolve the language to make this a little nicer as we move forward.
Maybe
and the reason Damien says I like it is because go ahead. Oh, emojis. The reason I am not the reason I'm not a huge fan is because of this, the noise. Like
it's
the pass of result. It's like angle bracket hell. But yeah, there's no better way to express the syntax like without a language feature. So that's where we currently are. I guess other features worth calling out, filters. I did this super giant filter to validate parameters because I made Damien. Damien had
I made the changes that you asked for, by the way.
You did. So, I should update. Damien made this awesome package to the arguments and methods, and I took it, and then it did too much stuff, and then I found the bug on Damien's issue, and then I rewrote the filter.
The package does a lot more, by the way. The package actually, like all the results of T stuff you just showed, it works down level in .NET 6 as well if you use my package.
Ooh, I don't care about that. That's fine.
Yeah, you don't care about that, but the package does more than just validation.
Yeah. This filter, what it does is it's a pretty advanced way to add a filter. By the way, this is like not the typical way you add filters. Normally, there's a call to like builder add. Is it here? No, it's on the other thing. So you can add filters like by calling group.add filter, add endpoint filter, or add endpoint filter factory. I'm doing the thing that is not well known, where you get access to an endpoint convention builder, and then you add a convention to the builder, and then within here, the builder has a filter factories list you can add to. Those other calls just basically do the same thing, but in a cleaner way, so you don't see the goop. And this basically says, find me the method that I'm looking at for the endpoint. If you don't have one, return null. Find all the parameters that are marked with types that I want to actually run here. And if I don't find any, like, don't do anything at all. So this actually no ops if you don't have a thing to be there. And then it can also change. So in the OpenAPI spec, you have to describe all the responses and the response types. A filter can, or a convention can on the fly determine what other response types can be returned. So it's not just what I put here. It's not just the OK not found. This filter says if I'm gonna apply this filter, add this response type, because that is now a potential option to return from this endpoint.
Yeah, so the method that's adding the filter, the wrapper method that Fowler created, the custom one, it's not only adding a filter conditionally, because sometimes it doesn't add the filter, right? When he said no op, it can mutate the endpoint, right? So that's a really important distinction, is that if you just say add endpoint filter, the delegate or the typey parts in there can't edit the endpoint. It can add code around the endpoint that will run when the filter is executed or the endpoint's executed. But this pattern means that he can just not add the filter. Like he said, nope, I'm not going to do it. So there's zero cost. Like there's literally no per request cost at all if the endpoint doesn't opt in via whatever mechanism that is. And then secondly, it can mutate the endpoint through metadata. And because of how endpoint routing and metadata works in ASP.NET Core, it is kind of fundamental primitive that you can, once the endpoint is built after app startup, it's effectively static. Like it doesn't change, right? It's immutable.
Right.
And then requests are routed to that endpoint as they come in through the routing mechanism. But before it's built, you can party on it and like change stuff through these types of things. So it's a really, really interesting and flexible way of building stuff.
There was a question in the chat about type results after results. There is like a fundamental issue with the whole type results versus results thing. If we had, so okay, I guess I'll F12. If you look at results, right, everything here returns a result, right? But it actually internally calls type results. It's pretty funny to return the concrete type. One of the big issues was in C#, if you have this situation where you return not found or okay, it can't resolve this. It can't figure out what type should be inferred based on returning either OK of T or not found. There's no way to represent this type in C#. So results exist because in the results world, they're all the same interface. It's iResult.
And that's different to other languages, including other type languages. Some type languages will attempt to do what's it called, like best fit or best type matching or something. It's like a thing in the inference.
So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because like both of those types implement the same interface. Because you might be saying, well, why can't it just walk both those types, find the common interface, and then just say, okay, I'll just infer the method as returning that interface.
Is that the same as duck typing?
No, it's not duck typing. Because the compiler, what I just said, the compiler will do if you explicitly say, I want you to mark this as returning iResult, then you can just say return create result or not found, and it will go, oh, okay, that's okay, because I can resolve both of those to the concrete one that you said. What it won't do is infer a common type from different concrete types.
Got it. Okay.
And there's like a whole bunch of like compiler computer science reasons why they don't do that. And Fowler might be able to explain it. I can't explain why, but he'll explain it.
This is the issue. So like results dot okay, right? This works fine, right? Because these are both iResult. But if you make this like typed results, compiler can't figure this out. It can't resolve this expression because these are two like different types, right? And the compiler does not like walk inheritance hierarchies to try to see if they both implement a common base, right? To see if there's a best match here.
Now, isn't there a way though? Isn't there like a weird in between where sometimes you only have to set one branch to a concrete type that's common, and then it will do it?
Once you force it, so I don't know what the concrete type here would even be, but like
if you put iResult there, will it resolve it there? I don't know if it'll work in that situation.
Yeah. No, it's like, okay, there you go, iResult.
And you might be like, why does that matter? Like, why is that okay? Why will it happily infer one branch from another when one is a lower type, but not one to another when they both have a common ancestor? And again, I don't know the answer. I know that there's good reasons. I just don't know what they are.
I think that it also occurs when you have like nullable.
Yes, nullable ints and stuff like that as well. Yeah.
If I do z equals thing, this is getting so hard to read. A or x plus b.
This is definitely not a rabbit hole.
I think this works. like they solved this.
They solved that one.
Wow.
And this I think this didn't used to work before. But you had to cast. I think if I do an int, I got b.
I think it's if z is an int. Is that what it is? If z was declared as an int and then one of the branches.
It can't resolve this. So this is a good one. So like you have to cast this to that to make it work.
Right.
By default, it'll be like, I don't know what this thing is. Like you gave me an integer and you give me null. Like what is z?
Even though it knows what one side is, and the other side can be cast to it, but only explicitly, not implicitly.
Yep. I think this works too. Right.
Super interesting. So as someone said in the chat, the solution is union types. At least for our scenario, in my mind, the to get the good mix between like line 31 there, where the return type is inferred because they're both iResult, and line 40, where it's all explicit. The ideal world is that you could just use a keyword like union, or the language could just infer it. And then when in situations where it detects that you're returning completely different types, or maybe types with a common ancestor, it can just go, oh, that's fine. I'll just generate you a union type on the fly, and the method signature will be a union type. And then anything looking at that or calling it will need to know how to deal with a union type. For whatever version of union types they end up deciding on using, because there's different flavors of union types. Like F# has a bunch of good support for union types already.
Mm. Cool.
And so, someone asked, does this use implicit operators to get results? Yes. The results of T class, if you go and look at the definition for that, like if Fowler hits F12 on it, it uses implicit operators. If you scroll down, it's constrained to iResult. The original prototype wasn't. And like action result of T and MVC is not, which classically creates a bunch of issues. But this one is. But it has implicit operators, as you can see right there, line 61, which means that the T that you've declared can just be implicitly cast. The results can be implicitly cast to the T's.
Yep. Crazy.
It's pretty cool.
All right. Wow. We're coming up on 2 hours, so we should probably wrap up. I know.
Whoa.
Yeah, this is super interesting. I'm glad that we got you both on here. And for folks watching in the chat or in the comments, let us know what stuff you'd like to see in upcoming stand-ups. I don't know.
All these ad hoc workshops. Like if you get
there you go.
we can just talk for hours. Ad hoc interactive workshop. Just bring whatever you want. We'll just. Yeah.
Did we cover basically everything in this TodoAPI, or if you have time,
there's more.
There's
more. Yeah.
All right.
It's like telemetry and
open telemetry.
Yeah.
There is the
do you have Thai? Do you run it locally with Thai?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a bunch of stuff.
I must have it installed. There's definitely more here.
There you go. Okay, cool.
Magic.
So let's do part 2 then.
Awesome. Part 2.
Okay. Part 2.
Part 2 coming.
All right, wonderful. Okay, well, thanks everybody. This is amazing and awesome. And you know what? We have exciting thanks for watching music also.
What?
Yeah.
Let me hear this craziness.
All right, here goes.